Good afternoon. This is the third issue of the program Near West, a program about Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine. This program was initiated by intellectuals and journalists. We're now talking about common experience of these three countries, about common challenges and the ways how to solve them. Today we are talking about economics, about economic and social issues, about what happened in the 90s, why Ukraine's Western neighbors succeeded and how Ukraine can catch up them. As usual, we're talking with three people, one from Ukraine, another one from Poland, and another one from Lithuania. I'm glad to present today's guests. Jakub Majmurek from Poland.
Hello, welcome.
Jakub Majmurek, born 1982, is a political commentator, film critic and art critique. He is the co-author of many books on film history and social and political philosophy, including The Ideas of Communism II. He writes for political criticism Dziennik Pni, Gazeta Wyborcza, Wirtualna Polska, Tygodnik Powzięci, the Polish version of Le Monde Diplomatique, and Bez Dogmatu. Other projects include online publication for Polish radio and Lewicka.pl. Majmurek is currently working on his doctorate in political philosophy at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology at the Polish Academy of Science.
Algis Krupavicius from Lithuania.
Algis Krupavicius was born in 1961, is a Lithuanian political scientist, historian and president of the Lithuanian Association of Political Science. Since 1989, he has been a lecturer at the Kaunas University of Technology. Since 1992, head of politics and government at Kaunas University, and since 2004, expert in the Scientific Council. His field of research stretches from comparative and state policies to party and electoral systems, as well as post-communist transformations. Krupavicius is the author of over 10 books, including The Party System in Central and Eastern Europe and The Elections to the Seimas of Lithuania in 1996. Turnout, analysis, documents and data.
Timothy Milovanov from Ukraine.
Timothy Milovanov, born in 1975, is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Pittsburgh, Honorary President of the Kiev School of Economics, the founder and chairman of the National Bank of Ukraine and co-founder of Vox Ukraine, an organisation that brings together a group of global economists who work on policy issues in Ukraine. In 2004, he received his Ph.D. in economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He taught at the universities of Pennsylvania, Bonn and Pittsburgh. Timothy Milovanov conducts research in the field of game theory, theory of contracts and institutional design. In 2014, Ukraine Forbes marked him as one of the most influential economic thinkers of our time.
My colleagues have prepared a story about the so-called shock therapy which happened in Poland in late 80s and early 90s. Let's have a look.
Shock therapy, it's a window of opportunity that comes once in history and quickly disappears. Polish reformer Leszek Balcerowicz repeats it tirelessly. On the one hand, in the late 1980s in Poland, there was a class of private entrepreneurs. On the other hand, there were, as in Ukraine, a huge complex of old mines, mills and factories, mired in debt and dependent on government subsidies. In the first place, there were the welfare interests of their top management, not the laws of the market. Shock therapy by Finance Minister Leszek Balcerowicz was designed to stabilise the macroeconomy, particularly to overcome inflation, transfer prices and trade onto market rules, create market institutions, banks, stock exchanges and state regulators. Firstly, Leszek Balcerowicz removed subsidies to state enterprises. This free money meant they couldn't receive profits, but it felt great. In addition to this, state refineries and factories could no longer sell their products for nothing when the difference between the real cost and the provisional budget was covered. Closing unprofitable enterprises and the reform of existing ones led to tens of thousands of people being left without work. Many lost hope, vision and felt deceived. But because of this, Poland didn't have to face its own oligarchy, and it's precisely because of the abuse of state resources that Ukrainian oligarchs received their profits. And this is what led to the failure of the first attempts of reforms in Ukraine. Those who swayed from the status quo with the bold plans for change, such as Economy Minister Viktor Pędzennik or Prime Minister Viktor Yushchenko, were not required in the post-Soviet governments for long. Arrangements between the former communists and young oligarchs were important for economic recovery. First came in the government to protect their own interests and those of oligarchs. Secondly, they actively profited from the state's budget. Instead of a market economy, there was economic rent. Lithuania's course of economic change wasn't as rapid as Poland's and isn't as slow as Ukraine's. Vilnius consistently fulfilled the requirements for joining the European Union.
So we see the story, in a way, all the topics we're going to discuss now, the topics of reforms, the topics of oligarchy, the topics of poverty. And my first question will be to our Polish colleague, to Jakub. So Jakub, what do you think, in which way the Balcerowicz reforms can be applied now to Ukraine?
Well, I think it's very difficult to answer that question. I think that definitely you can't copy the reforms from the 25 years ago from a different country to completely different political, social and economic context. Poland in the 1989 wasn't so strongly politically polarized as Ukraine today. I think there was huge support for this kind of radical reforms. Virtually everyone agreed that socialist planned economy bankrupted and it can't go no more, that we need a radical change. And all the political parties, as well as labor unions, were ready to support reforms brought by Balcerowicz, even though they were connected with very harsh social costs from the very beginning, with high unemployment, with hyperinflation, which Balcerowicz, at least at the beginning of his plan, wasn't able to control as he predicted, with the economic recession and a decline in the nominal and real GDP. So I think that it is completely impossible to have this kind of political support for any radical plan in Ukraine right now. Also in Poland in the 1989 there were no strong oligarchic group who have their own interests, who have resources to fight any kind of reforms which would threaten their interests, their way of doing business, and it wasn't the problem back in the 90s in Poland. Of course, we did have a kind of communist nomenclatura which had many vested interests, but they were also kind of interested in market reforms. They were believing that the market reforms could benefit them economically, and there was no strong vested interest group which would oppose Balcerowicz's plans back then.
It's very interesting. I think we're coming back to this opposition thing, because I remember these elections when the Solidarność was just crashing, the Communist Party. Algis, what do you think? What is the Lithuanian example? What is the Lithuanian experience?
Yeah, first of all, you need to have a political elite which has a vision and understanding what they need to do. And I think a major difference between Lithuania and Ukraine, if you go back to the early 1990s, Ukraine was not ready for democracy and not even ready for independence. Lithuania was really struggling for independence since 1988 and as well for democracy. And we developed alternative elite, and this alternative elite was massively pushed to power in 1990. And Lithuania was the first to declare independence. And but the process, of course, was really very complicated and difficult. And if you look on the transformation, the market economy and economic reforms is just one point in a picture. Ralph Dahrendorf was writing I think in 1990 in his small book on revolution in Europe, but the task of post-communist transition transition is one, to make a democratic system, and you can do this in 6 months. It's quite an easy process. Of course, politicians still need to learn rules and to apply these rules. You need 6 years to invent, to build up some basics of market economy, and you need 60 years to have civic society in place, democratic, accountable, and the real civil society as such. And Lithuania was really a little bit different from Polish case, and Lithuania followed a little bit Polish case. We've not been jumping into shock therapy as Balcerowicz did, but our process was a little bit more evolutionary. And I think there was an agreement within the political elite that we need to make all these steps. Of course, we had hyperinflation, we had really the huge decline of GDP and many social problems. And in 1992, the first wave of reformers was voted out of power, and Sąjūdis was voted out of power, and ex-communist party came to rule the country. But still, even the ex-communist party had an idea, a very clear idea, that we need to implement all these reforms. And people and society, of course, was not satisfied, but for at least at the very beginning of reform period, was supporting all these steps.
Timothy, what I'm thinking, what colleagues were saying, what Jakub, for example, was saying about this oligarchy, I'm just thinking that, look, in Poland and Lithuania, then in the 90s, the process of privatization was completely different, because in Poland and Lithuania you just opened up to foreign capital, whereas in Russia and Ukraine you just opened up to nomenclatura, to party nomenclatura, which created this oligarchy. Don't you think that was one of the reasons why we have now the oligarchy, which is really opposing forced reforms?
Privatization certainly benefited the selected few. It wasn't done in a fair way. It wasn't done in an open way. And there's been fraud, plain fraud, during this voucher privatization, during the redistribution of vouchers. But it's not just privatization which was the issue. Even those enterprises which stayed in the ownership of the state have been used for rent-seeking, and they continue to be used for rent-seeking. So if we take this perspective, the issue is really not about privatization or not privatization, because both enterprises which were privatized ended up in the hands of the few, and enterprises which have not been privatized ended up benefiting the few. So the issue is really, how is it possible that in a country, and we're talking about Ukraine only, I have no comments about Russia because I don't understand much about Russia, but how is it possible that in a large country like this, like Ukraine, there have been groups of people which have been able to build power, and some of these groups, in fact, use criminal methods in 90s, right? So it's not that it's just nomenclature, as you just pointed out. Definitely nomenclature benefited. But it is not just nomenclature. We know that a lot of new-coming Ukrainians are not nomenclature. They are coming to power, or they have come to control the assets using some methods which are violent.
And in this case, it's a paradox, because when we look at Poland, for example, we see the reaction by PiS to these, pro-European reforms, and it's basically a reaction to those kind of reforms of Balcerowicz, etc. They are saying, look, you just opened up everything. There are foreign players who came in, and we are now against these foreign players. Whereas in Ukraine, it's just a sentiment that there is a terrible thing inside the country, which is oligarchs, which are half criminals. We should fight against them. So in a sense, their processes are a little bit similar, don't you think?
Well, I think that the opposition to the fact that foreign capital owns important branches of Polish economy are only the part of the reason why Law and Justice Party is now in power. Of course, we're using this rhetoric that especially the banking sector, financial sector is too strongly controlled by foreign capital, which was quite true like 5 years ago, but until that time a lot of foreign-held banks were sold to Polish companies, very often companies owned by the state. So it's not longer actually that's true, and this financial sector is quite well regulated by the state. But nonetheless, they are also using this rhetoric. They are using this rhetoric that this is a great scandal, but that trade is controlled by big Western supermarket chains, and that we should support Polish shopkeepers. But nonetheless, they are actually unable to do anything significant to change it.
But that's interesting. Sorry, I interrupted. Probably Timothy will answer, because in Ukraine, when we talk about reforms, we are talking about how we should make society better, but we also, the rhetoric is, let's bring investors in. Like, let's bring foreign investors.
Supports that. But definitely there are people, and I might be one of those, who would think that bringing foreign investment, foreign direct investment, and other ways of influence might be beneficial to Ukraine. And one of the arguments is that we have tried so many different things here over the 25 years that the downside risk seems to be limited. We have to do something which we have not been trying to do. So that's one argument. And the hope here is that by bringing in foreign culture, foreign technology perhaps, but most importantly, foreign corporate and political culture, we will be able to move towards a more civilized way of building and conducting business. But I can also see how people are threatened by unlimited capital coming from the West or from China for that matter, and buying out some assets, and people are talking about speculation and so on and so forth. I don't buy that, because in the end of the day, the assets which are in Ukraine belong ultimately to Ukraine. And you can tax the profits out of the foreign companies, you can impose barriers, you can do other things. That will hurt economy in the long run potentially, but it's not the end of the day. It's not that they're coming here, packing, land and moving it out of the country. So this argument that they will somehow abuse us is of limited validity. At the same time, this hope that foreigners will come and save us, I think is not justified. The issue, I think, with Ukraine is that we first need to understand who we are. The difference between Ukraine and Poland and Lithuania, and for that matter all other Baltic countries, or even Central European countries, is that it was not obvious in 1992 or 1993 and even 2004 whether we are really different from Russia, whether we are really a sovereign nation, and what we want, who we are, and where we want to move. And therefore, we have to figure out it ourselves, and no foreigners will help us. Now, that is not to say that we want to be isolationists. We don't want to, we welcome anything, we should welcome anything, and we should learn. So it is a little bit of a challenging process. To this day, I'm not sure that everyone in Ukraine would like to move west. To this day, I meet people daily, including in TV studios, who think that Euromaidan was a bad thing and destroyed the country. To this day, I meet Western economists, like Jeffrey, for instance, who off record say things that Ukraine should be reintegrated with some of the countries neighboring with Ukraine. And so I think we first need to acquire sovereignty, intellectual sovereignty, then we will acquire leadership and civil society, which might take 60 years to build, will be able to move the country forward.
But my question to you, Lithuanian example and Polish example are different in the sense that the fact that this opening up to foreign countries, to foreign markets, did not produce political results in Lithuania as they produced in Poland. Because there was no rise of, as far as we understand, there is no rise of big political nationalism, etc. How do you explain it?
It's true and not true altogether. I think, of course, nationalism in every new democracy is on a slight rise, at least. Yeah, and we have some nationalism, unfortunately, as many Eastern European countries have. But the point is that in Lithuania we had a kind of synergy of local businesses and foreign businesses. And for instance, in the banking sector, yes, we have a really strong strong foreign banks. Telecoms also been privatized or sold to foreign companies. But for instance, trade chains are really almost fully Lithuanian and dominating market. And in Lithuania has no problem with industries, such huge industries as you have here in Ukraine. Also, size of the country matters, because in a smaller country you have a freedom to maneuvering, and in a large country, of course, you need to make many things on a large scale, and this is really difficult.
If I may add something, I think that, as I've said, it's not just the opening of the market for the foreign investors which created this nationalist reaction. I think that the more important things are the hyperinflation of the early 90s. It is the falling incomes of many social groups, especially industrial workers and agricultural workers in the beginning of the 90s. It was fueling the protest and populist political reaction even before the great privatization, which started like in the end of the 1990s, the beginning of 1991. It was already fueling very strong populist reaction, and Stan Tymiński, a very shady businessman coming from Canada, was able to enter to the second tour of the presidential election, and he actually beat first on communist prime minister Tadeusz Mazowiecki. And it was before the privatization actually began. It was all due to the fact that suddenly the prices were rising extremely fast, that the unemployment after the 45 years of communist system where officially there was no unemployment appeared, and that the incomes of many social groups were started to falling. And later, for the almost a decade, we used to have double digits unemployment in Poland. This is a huge social cost of Polish transformation. But in the end of the 90s, in the beginning of 2000s, there was almost 20% of unemployment in Poland due to the industrialization and due to the fact that many uncompetitive industries had to be placed out of business. And this was fueling political reaction, populist reaction, more strongly than the fact that foreign investors were buying Polish assets, I think.
Yeah, but look, we had basically the same in Ukraine. We had hyperinflation, we didn't have such unemployment, but the point is that the jobs we have, hidden unemployment, and the jobs people have sometimes are just not that
they don't
jobs.
Pay much.
They don't pay much. So what we Ukrainians try to understand is basically why we had the same problems but did not have the same reforms, right? Maybe we have a little quote from Stefan Meister, who is a German political expert, and we asked him about the shock therapy and what he thinks.
I'm a bit skeptical about shock therapy. We have this bad experience in Russia and post-Soviet Russia where it does just not work. I think it was a very particular situation in Poland after the wall came down, after the break of the Eastern Bloc, where really there was a consensus among elites and society that we want to have this change. And I think that was a very special situation. It can go wrong like in Russia, that you really have poverty, you don't have a functioning state. You have a weak state, which is not able to manage this period. And I think Ukraine is also in a situation where everything has to be changed, And if you have in this situation shock therapy, you might lose the society, you might lose the support, the public support, and it's really a question if institutions are able to manage this change. So I think it really needs to think about how to take people with, how to explain to the people, and that this is a process where everybody has to participate, And I in this sense, I don't think that shock therapy would be really the right way to do it.
So we're coming back. We just listened to this quote, and my question for you, just to end this blog, is to, Mr. Master is saying about the skepticism, about the quick reforms or shock therapy. Does it mean that Ukraine has to be slow right now? Does it mean that we don't have to move quick, just more, slower? Timothy, what do you think?
Well, it's a normative question you seem to be asking. Does it mean it has to? I think there is reality on the ground, and we all hoped for fast reforms, but they are not coming. It is good that some reforms are coming. through, and the third government after the revolution is still maintaining the relationship with the society and with the foreign politicians and with donors, maintaining the promises. So I think we have to push forward, we have to protect what we have gotten, and most importantly, we have to protect people who have carried those reforms. Because what these 2 or 3 years have shown to us are the people who care about Ukraine, people who can deliver in very difficult circumstances. And I hope there will be in the future the windows of political opportunity to conduct maybe faster reforms, and these people will be able to do that. So I think it has to do fast reforms, but it can't at this moment.
Okay, thank you, Algis.
So, but also you need social support for every reform, because if you have no social support, then you end up again to the fourth revolution or something similar. And in Lithuania, the political elite was looking for the support, not always had the support, but still I think was really a very central point.
Well, I'm afraid it might be a kind of stalemate situation, because from the one hand, it is quite clear that you need to reform a lot of things. From the other, in the situation of a very strong polarization of society, as I've said here, it is extremely difficult, and the costs of reforms which would be implemented too rapidly can be very high. They were high even in Poland, when in the beginning there was huge consensus surrounding these reforms of Balcerowicz, and I can't even imagine how strong the repercussions can be later if implementation of a reform in the conditions of strong political polarization would lead, for example, for some kind of a temporary fall of incomes of large groups of population.
That's a very important topic, and a topic of social policy and of poverty, and we'll come back to it in a minute. So we continue our program, and we're talking about economic and social issues in Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine. We ended up with the topic of poverty, and my question to you may be a little bit global. What are the causes of poverty, if we're thinking globally, and particularly in Eastern and Central Europe? Is it the past? Is it bad institutions? Is it old economy? What are the reasons?
Many. Economy, of course, because capitalism producing social inequality, and some people becoming rich, some not. This is really important, and also governments need to find out instruments how to introduce or reintroduce more social justice and more social equality via taxes, via other different systems, and economy. Reforms, of course, important point. But if you look from political point of view, we had really very right-wing reforms in the 1990s, and after the period of reforms, you need to make some reforms very fast. Say privatization. You can't wait with privatization. You need to do in few years. That's it, and you are done. After, you need to look for a mechanism how to make more balanced situation. But still in Lithuania we have a problem with poverty, and of course we have EU structural funds, EU cohesion funds, and we helping, but and we have immigration from the country, and it's not only a very bright picture, and we can tell that every country has own problems.
Jakub, how you interpret the return of the right wing in Poland? Is it a revolution of the poor?
Well, I wouldn't say that, because actually if you look at the results of Law and Justice Party from the last elections, you can see that they won more or less in every income group. Their victory in the better off social groups was not so significant, not so impressive as among the poorer ones, but nonetheless they were able to attract the majority of votes in more or less all income brackets. I would say that this is maybe not the revolution of the poor, the people who are completely deprived, who are living in absolute poverty. But the victory of the Law and Justice Party had a lot to do with the problems of inequalities, of relative poverty, and of the fact that a lot of people in Poland were feeling that the benefits of the transformation are not evenly and not justly divided between all. And this is the issue which was driving the force of Law and Justice Party. I think that one of the greatest problems with the Polish model of development which was applied after 1989 was that it was very strongly based off low wages. Where the most competitive thing in Polish economy for a long time were low wages. For some time it was able to produce some wealth, it was able to mobilize some kind of resources, and maybe it was necessary to build the economy on this kind of thing in the transition period. But now the population is very strongly starting to oppose it. A lot of people are emigrating from Poland to developed Western countries. They are working in the countries like Netherlands, UK. We'll see how is it going to look after Brexit in Germany. And they can see that both in relative, in absolute terms, the wages of even low-skilled workers in the Western countries are far better. The working conditions are far better than they are in Poland. And this was a kind of revolution against the model of development, which was very strongly based on exploitation of low-paid, ununionized, unqualified workforce.
So the basically is about you're going abroad, and you still see that despite all the reforms, you are poorer than the Spaniards and the Germans, etc. But I will ask my colleagues just to show you the infographics that we made. It's a kind of a comparison of equality, richness and poorness in our three countries. It shows us basically that there is a discrepancy of income between the poor and the rich, and that there are poor and rich in every country. But the problem is that Ukrainians rich are richer than those in Poland or Lithuania, and Ukrainian poor are poorer than those in Poland and Lithuania. How do you comment on it? Why is that this inequality in Ukraine, and how we can overcome it?
I think this is correct, that top, let's say 10 people even, or top 1 or 2% have accumulated a relatively larger share of wealth relative to neighboring countries. I believe we have looked in one of our projects that the top 10 Ukrainians have about 20% of GDP. And this is larger than in Russia, this is larger than in Poland, this is larger than every country close to Ukraine. And it is at the same time is true that the poor might be at the most extreme end. How do you change that? Well, that's $1 billion question, or maybe $100 billion question. I think you need to give opportunities to people, especially at the lower end. And we need to talk about justice, and we need to talk about social justice. But very roughly speaking, and I'm simplifying a lot, there are two types of justice. One is the outcome justice, and one is the opportunity justice. And in the changing world, it is important that people have the opportunity to acquire skills which make them competitive in the economic environment. It is true today that, let's say in Kyiv, you have companies which are struggling to hire people at European salaries because there are no qualified staff, or labor force is very limited in terms of skills. And many companies will tell you the stories. Now, this segment is very thin. It's not a large economy, but partly that part of the economy is thin because there's no labor. It's a vicious circle. And if we look at, let's say, a farmer somewhere in, let's say, Poltava region, where do they get proper education? Where do they learn to code so that they can be hired by a PAM office in Kyiv, which pays $2,000 right away, after they sell their pie or piece of land to a company which will put them out of jobs after they introduce the new technology, agricultural technology. So this piece is missing in Ukraine. We do not invest as the country into providing these people with educational opportunities, both at the level when they are growing, I'm talking about schools, and also at the adult level, or at the improving and giving them an opportunity to acquire skills which will make them competitive. And I think that's a part of the problem. Because if people cannot change, cannot be competitive, they'll be left behind because the technology will move, the companies will come in, maybe later or earlier, they will come in. They will put these people out of jobs. The mines will be shut down, the inefficient agricultural farms will be shut down, things will be shut down. We need to give these people a chance to learn, to get new skills.
Doesn't mean that who can give this outcome justice? I think outcome justice is really the extremely important point for many governments and many countries. And I think in 2014 was a very famous chat named most important chat about American economy, showing since Second World War how inequality was moving up all the time. And even during the crisis, financial crisis 2008, 2010, rich people became more rich and poor became more poor. And this is really huge issue, how to deal with this problem. And I think now we have kind of new political cycle, but many governments looking about outcome justice. And of course, in case of Ukraine, you have a really huge peak of injustice and inequality and poverty, including.
Do you understand you correctly, Timothy, when you're saying that there is a cool book just published in Ukrainian, the translation, I mean, Why Nations Fail, by Gemoglu and Robinson, who are saying that, look, there are extractive institutions and there are inclusive institutions, right? So there are institutions that just benefit the few and there are institutions that benefit the wider number of people. So do I understand you correctly that this is the way we should move forward?
This is a very useful perspective. We can see in Ukraine that there is a popular demand for people to have a voice. Maidan is one example, but there are others. People are unhappy with the situation, they raise their voice, and unfortunately, the institutions, the political institutions are weak and they can't channel the voice, so we end up with violence. So there is demand for inclusiveness. But 2 or 3 years later, after the most recent Maidan, can we say that people are included in the decision making? I'm not so sure. Some people say it's much different. I agree we moved forward, but I don't see a lot of truly ideological political parties representing different spectrum and people raising concerns of voting in local or in national elections and bringing giving power to their representatives. Instead, I see a lot of decision making which is sometimes non-transparent. I see influence by foreign donors, absolutely. But I would like to see Ukrainians who want to get that voice to be able to raise that voice. So this is true that if we take the perspective of Robinson Acemoglu, or Acemoglu, as might be the more correct pronunciation, if we take their perspective, the Ukraine has not moved towards the more inclusive institutions all the way. But it is clearly that it has moved somewhat in that direction, because today we see the government responding to the popular demands or popular discontent. We have seen a number of initiatives that the president or the prime minister have supported, and after seeing a backlash, they stopped. So there is some reaction, but this reaction is not institutionalized. I agree with you about the outcome justice. The issue is, can we really ensure that the few who still continue to be rich do not abuse the majority? And again, I'm not so sure that today this majority is being protected through the political process in Ukraine. So this is the problem. We need to think that the survival for Ukraine, the issue of survival of Ukraine as a state is obviously an issue today, as Russia has demonstrated. And in order to survive as the country, we need to include people in the decision making. They will not protect the government. They will not protect the sovereignty of the country until they feel that they are part of this country. And they don't feel part of this country if they don't take part in the decision making.
That is very interesting. It brings us back to the Polish context, because, well, we can also interpret this peace coming to power as a kind of, not revolution of the poor, but revolution of the marginalized, or of those who are not included, of those who are excluded. And the liberals are tending to say, look, there is right-wing populists and there is just crazy guys, but maybe there is something, real in all this story, and maybe this is also a stage going back to a more inclusive society. What do you think?
Well, I wouldn't say by any means that law and justice is going to build any more inclusive society, because they have this vision of government that because they won the election, because they got the majority in the lower house of the parliament, and they can form their government without any coalition partner, but they have the mandate to do whatever they bloody want. So I don't think that they are trying to include society in the process of decision-making. On the contrary, Jarosław Kaczyński, the actual leader of Law and Justice Party and the kind of, supervising force above Prime Minister Beata Szydło, he always said that there should be some very narrow political center which is commanding the political life of the nation, and any ideas of more participation and more inclusion isn't something which he would be happy to give to the people. What he would be happy to give to the people is to fuel their resentments about former elites and to punish this elites for their supposed sins. Definitely, I think that the victory of Law and Justice Party was a kind of failure of Polish liberalism, which from the beginning of the 90s was quite conservative, which was very strongly preoccupied with economy and with economic reforms and not with the political reforms, not with building the real grassroots support for democratic institutions and for liberal sensibilities. And Polish liberals are now paying a price for it.
I think we'll also come back to this issue a little bit later, but let me just break at this moment, because we touched upon a very important issue of poverty and richness, and our next block will be on oligarchs. So let's come back in a minute. So we're coming back and discussing economic and social issues in Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine, and our next topic is oligarchy. And here I would like to come back to what Algis was saying about the Western societies, because, for example, I think there is a book of Jeffrey Winters about oligarchy, in which he's saying that basically US also has oligarchy, which is called civil oligarchy. And when we look at Donald Trump, for example, we see the typical oligarch coming to power, or striving to come to power. So why the developed societies as the United States are not immune to oligarchy, and how can we, much less developed maybe, societies?
Because United States is a huge country, and wealth and businesses are very concentrated, yes, and smaller countries, I guess, have a little less concentration. And yes, in Lithuania we also have this discussion about oligarchs, about influence of oligarchs, about the role, etc., etc. But on the other hand, we have quite diversified businesses. We have quite a plural environment. We are not dependent on 2, 3, or 4 business groups and people who are not only influential in business but in politics and in media, etc., etc. I think in case of Lithuania, these discussions about oligarchs are a little bit out of reality. Yes,
tell us, do you have oligarchs in Lithuania?
In what sense? I think not real. Yes, we have influential people who really have some power. They can talk and discuss with politicians in face to face, and also they have some influence in media. But I think media is quite independent, at least at this moment, and this is really important, because oligarch means concentration power in at least 3 areas: media, politics, and economy. And yes, we have influential people in economy with links to politics. We have influential people in politics with some links to media, maybe. And media also has links with businesses, of course, because media in itself is business.
What about Poland, Jakub?
Well, I don't think actually we do have an oligarchs. If you look at the 100 most wealth Poles, you can see that the share of the GDP they accumulated isn't actually so high, not only in comparison with 100 the wealthiest Ukrainians, or maybe 10 wealthiest Poles and 10 wealthiest Ukrainians. You can see that the share of the national wealth they owe isn't such high, but even in the comparison with Hungary, for example, when you or with the Czech Republic, the Polish
What are the reasons for that? I mean,
I think that the model of Polish privatization, the fact that many of the industries were actually sold to foreign companies, and also the fact that a lot of Polish businessmen who are trying to maybe become an oligarchs, in some time they were seeing that that the Polish market is too strongly open for international competition. In some moment they just have to sold to the more powerful business players, mainly some international companies. So, and also the relationship between business and politics wasn't in Poland never so cozy as it is in Russia or in Ukraine. Of course, there were very wealthy individuals who benefited, for example, from the privatization or from businesses made with the government, from government contracts, subsidies, and so on. The richest Pole who died 1 year ago, Jan Kulczyk, he made the great money mainly on privatization, but his business model was that he was buying some state-owned enterprises as a representative of the Polish capital of Polish business, and he was later selling it to some foreign companies. He's made his first great money by buying some breweries from the state and selling them for much more to Submiller, one of the biggest brewery company in the world. So this was this kind of model, and he used to have very big influence mainly on post-communist governments, but nonetheless, it wasn't. It was never on the scale of Russia or Ukraine.
Timothy, when we're talking about oligarchs in Ukraine, do you see any progress of de-oligarchization?
Well, two things. One, what does it mean to be an oligarch? So that's a vague statement. Although intuitively we all understand that that's a rich person. There is some unfairness towards the means of acquisition and maybe some influence on the politics, because we don't call big foreign investors oligarchs. If they effectively own a major asset in Ukraine, we don't say, well, listen, there is this pension fund from the US, hypothetically speaking, which has bought half of energy distribution. Now we have an American oligarch. We don't say that. So there is something about what we mean by oligarch. It's not just concentration of wealth or resources. But there is also a question, what do we mean by de-oligarchization? Definitely, these people who we call oligarchs in Ukraine have become substantively poorer, much less wealth than 2 or 3 years ago. If you look at Rinat Akhmetov, he's basically is in 2, 3, 4 kind of digits in terms of billions of dollars. It depends on how you count. But we're talking about dropping his overall estimate of wealth by 10 times over some of the best times he has had. So, you know, in that sense, there is the oligarchization. And some people might even say that majority of oligarchs today are de facto bankrupt. That if you count the obligations they have and the assets they have and the expected revenues, they don't meet the ends. So in that sense, de-oligarchization might have happened. But if you talk about their influence on politics, on regulators, on capturing the state, on attempts to use rent-seeking to recover their losses, I'm not so sure that the oligarchization has happened. Now, I am not standing next to regulators. I am not in the rooms where the phone calls are made. So I do not have evidence which is 100% convincing that oligarchs have influence on the state. But I do not see also people having a lot of influence on the state. And I believe when there is vacuum, someone is having influence on the state. And of course we need political party financing. So someone is financing parties. If you look at the reports, I think of one of the major parties, either BPP, ONF, or some of other parties, the declared of money, amount of money that they are spending, the amount of contribution that they are spending per MP in the parliament is in the numbers of $10, $20, $100 per quarter, per 3 months. This is a joke. It's not enough to pay a salary to the assistant, right? So there is some kind of source of money going somewhere, financing somehow our political process. And we know that all our media in Ukraine, well, they don't have revenue, right? So someone is financing our national TV channels. And it's definitely not people by donations and not state. Well, maybe indirectly, secretly. So I would say we have a lot of indirect evidence that the oligarchization in the sense of independence of the state and media from a group of wealthy people, well, in that sense, the oligarchization is not there.
Hopefully we are on the media right now, which is not paid by oligarchs. But my question is, how do we proceed? Do I understand correctly that basically the only, we can talk about inclusiveness, everything, about engaging people, but the Polish example shows us that the only remedy against the oligarchs is just open up and to foreign, multinationals. And then you have the whole another bunch of problems, meaning the multinational can come and then can go. What do you think?
Well, you can also build economy which is where the role of the public sector is more is stronger. This was the way that Slovenia did it for some time. It was working quite well. Recently, they started to have some serious problems. But you can also imagine the economic transformation when the most important assets are kept as the property of the state and are running as a public companies. So this is the other way, and you also can try, and this is what the Central European countries were trying, some kind of scheme of general privatization. In Czech Republic, you have this kuponovka, this system when everyone was given a kind of share of national wealth, but it clearly didn't work out in these terms that the wealthiest Czech individuals were able to amass quite impressive amount of national wealth.
Algis,
yeah, but there are many instruments. For instance, party funding. In Lithuania, we made really very strict decisions about the external party funding, and now Lithuanian parties are really supported mainly by state donations. Yes, this is not the best instrument, but it's quite as a temporary mean. It's really okay. Also, concentration of businesses in one or another area, share of a market. If you're controlling well, and this will produce some results. And also look about pluralism in businesses, all businesses. You need to have foreign capital coming, you need local businesses and small, medium and large businesses. If you have kind of good mix, you might escape from huge problems of oligarchization.
Yeah, Timothy.
Well, I think the way forward is actually role models. So in Ukraine, there are people today who are self-made. There are many people who are self-made. But there is no culture of people who are self-made. And I'm not talking about people who are self-made through getting the right people close to the state coffers. I'm talking about people who build an international priced business. And we can talk about agriculture, we can talk about IT, we can talk about e-commerce, we can talk about some other problems. Think of Nova Pošta, think of Modna Kasta. These are people who I personally know, so I'm biased. But think of IT companies in Ukraine. They are successful, internationally competitive companies. A lot of services they produce are targeted towards outside of the country, so are competing with Chinese. They're complaining, some IT companies, I talked to Luxoft or EPAM, to someone, I don't remember, they were complaining that in the morning they get an order from the US, and if by the afternoon they don't make a bid, Chinese take them out. So they commit international. These are people who build their businesses in Ukraine. Now, we need to celebrate them. We need to show them to public that public can trust and can believe that you can come to success, you can rise to success without connections. There is this phenomenon of learned helplessness. It's the idea of 4 monkeys in a room and a banana on top of that. And if the monkey comes for the banana, they beat it. A trainer, an experimenter, hits it. And then they change one monkey at a time. And for the first 3 monkeys, they beat them whenever they try to take banana. After 4 monkeys, after all new monkeys are there, no one has seen, they stop beating the monkeys. But the monkeys themselves discipline each other. And after a while, there's not a single monkey which has seen how they're being beaten by an experimenter. But they know that if you climb for banana, you're going to get beaten up by other monkeys because they don't want to be beaten up by experimenters. Now, this is a culture which has set in. You have removed the experimenter who is beating up the monkeys. So monkeys have nothing anymore, no threat. They can go and get bananas, but they're afraid. And there's a culture which makes monkeys discipline each other, and they don't go for banana. And I think something like that there is in Ukraine. We have been trained here that if you have a successful business, bad guys will come to you. They will take over your business, and it was as recent as in 2013, or it's 2012. And this is not the case anymore. This is not the case anymore. There's no Yanukovych who takes over your business. But I think we have a phenomenon of learned helplessness. And you need to overcome that, and you show it by showing successful monkeys which got the banana and nothing happened to them.
That's very interesting, and I think we will just come back to our next block, but very brief, and I will ask you a question: how to be successful for Central and Eastern European countries. Timothy has just started this issue, but let's come back in a minute and ask that. So just to summarize, let me ask all of you your probably recipes or your advice how to become successful for a Central and Eastern European country. Jakub, let's start with you.
Well, it depends how would you define success. I think that what the Law and Justice victory in Poland expressed is that the Polish people have a success which can be translated into a decent standard of living, decent standard of work, decent wages, and so on. And you can't build this kind of society in the economy based on low cost of work, in the economy based on not very highly skilled work. And I think that the whole region, Poland and sooner or later also Ukraine would face it, is troubled by this, what is called the trap of the middle-income countries, but you can mobilize a lot of resources by competing with cheap labor, with not very highly skilled labor, but in some moment, these resources are not enough in order to get you from the middle-income country to a truly developed country. And at least in Poland, the demands of the general public, the expectations of the society are very high, and the people really believed that the integration into the European Union, which we are a part of for more than 10 years right now, would bring us to the first world finally, would make from us a truly developed country. And this model based on low skills, low incomes, low profits of the enterprises, low investments is a kind of vicious circle which is making it impossible to get out of this trap. And I think that this is the most vital question of the Polish politics right now, and whoever would answer it correctly would be able to rule like for a decade, is how to escape from this middle income trap and how to get from the middle income country to a truly developed country where the wealth would be justly distributed, justly in terms of social expectations. In Poland, we don't have this huge concentration on wealth in the members of the few individuals, but the problem is that the dominant wage, the dominant salary is quite low, and definitely much lower than the expectations of the society. And how to build the society which is able to escape from this trap? There are different answers. There is social democratic answer, which is putting the emphasis of the fact that in order to escape from the cheap labor economy, you have to strengthen the labor unions, you have to strengthen the workers, you have to stop cherishing the entrepreneur. The entrepreneurs were very cherished in Poland after 1891, and you have to look at the other social partners. You have to have a good practices of the state as the owner of the enterprises and so on. There is the other answer, which the Minister of Development, as it is called in Beata Szydło's government, Mateusz Morawiecki, is giving. And he is focusing on the greater investments of putting the money of the Poles, for example, from pension funds into the stock market, of concentration of investments into few national champions, and the kind of South Korean model of development based on production of highly technological production sold for export. And it's impossible now to give the answer which of these ideas is more correct, but whoever would define this problem in Poland, I think, would set the tone of a public debate for the next 10 years.
It's very interesting. Thank you. Algis?
So there is no single recipe, I guess, and every country has own recipe for this. But in Lithuania, for instance, as a success story, usually seen Ireland, because Ireland has really educated society, educated population. And Lithuania also moving in this direction very successfully. Ireland has a lot of foreign direct investments, not only EU investment, but again, this is important element. And, but looking back to Lithuania, I think social justice is extremely important. Quality of life as a very general goal, but still you need to give people really decent lives, and to majority of people, not some or a few, and many aspects. It's recipe is very complex and country specific, I guess.
Thank you. And Timothy?
Well, you gentlemen offered a macro perspective or macro political perspective, and I think you're both correct that there's no simple and single answer. And in that sense, I do not know what the macro answer for Ukraine is, because obviously Ukraine is surrounded by countries which have used different models, if we're talking about Russia, Poland, Belarus, Baltic countries, Turkey, you name it. And all of those models worked better in terms of GDP per capita than in Ukraine. Now, Moldova is an exception, but they also have a conflict. So it's not clear. I sort of agree with Andrei Schleifer. I am not sure if it's an on-record remark, but he mentioned something like that when asked about Ukraine, what you should do, what kind of reforms you should do. Well, his answer was, put the smart people in the right places and let them figure this out. So that would be my major boost for efficiency at the macro level. Get the smart people in the government, get the smart people in the governance around, and don't block them. Okay, let them figure this out. But at the individual level, I'll try what I can personally to increase the quality of life of me, my family, my company, people around me, and hopefully people who we can influence. So I think competence, commitment to change, patience, and perseverance, I think, would be the answers at the micro level.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I think we had a very interesting discussion. Timothy Milovanov, Jakub Majmurek, and Algis Krupavicius, Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania.
Thank you very much for your attention. Stay on Hromadske.